Hi, this is the recording to complete the slides for the second out of two lectures on the endocrine system. And in this lecture, I'm going to talk about several of the endocrine glands, the hormones that it produces, as well as the effects of these hormones on their target cells. I'm not going to cover all the endocrine glands and all the hormones that are produced in our body because I've reserved the time to actually talk about some of the hormones within the concept of, say, their specific system. For example, I'm not going to talk about the role of testosterone, progesterone, or estrogen in any depth in this lecture because we're going to visit it when we actually talk about the reproductive system and so on. So to begin with, I'd like to talk about the hypothalamus-pituitary axis. So as you can see from the name, it involves both the hypothalamus as well as the pituitary glands. The hypothalamus-pituitary axis is the command center of the endocrine system because between the three endocrine glands here, because there are two different types of pituitary glands, they control a majority of the glands that are produced throughout the body. The HPA is also responsible for coordinating the messages and the functions of the endocrine and nervous systems. And what I've done is I've basically copied and pasted the functions of the hypothalamus from an earlier lecture on the nervous system. So as you can see over here, it is involved with it links the nervous system to the endocrine system, and as we talked about before, the nervous system provides a very quick, rapid response, whereas the endocrine system provides a more sustained, longer-lasting, slower response. So between the two of them, they help the body to maintain homeostasis. When we talk about the hypothalamus-pituitary axis, what we can see is that these glands are connected anatomically and functionally. So we're going to look at the functional connections in the next few slides. But what you can see here is you can see the hypothalamus right here. And then you've got the pituitary glands over here, and the connection between the hypothalamus and the pituitary is by way of this pituitary stalk or the infundibulum, right? So again, when you look at the name hypothalamus, you can see that it's located inferior. That's what hypo is, below, under the thalamus, and in front of the thalamus. And as we said, it has both neural and endocrine system, whereas the two pituitary glands, which is sometimes referred to as the hypophysis, is located within the sella turcica bone. So the sella turcica is part of the sphenoid bone, which provides the internal infrastructure of the skull. The pituitary glands has only endocrine functions. And what you can see here is because it's seated within this hollow bony cavity, it has that location has ramifications if a person develops a pituitary tumor. But we're not going to talk about it in this course. You might actually learn more about it when you go on to pathophysiology or altered phys. So as I said, the pituitary glands, we have two of them. They're not separated into left and right. They're actually separated into front and back. So we've got the posterior pituitary at the back, and we've got the anterior pituitary in the front. The posterior pituitary is sometimes referred to as the neurohypophysis. And what happens is they're called the neurohypophysis because they don't actually produce hormones. In fact, the hormones that the posterior pituitary releases are actually produced by cell bodies in the hypothalamus. So you look over here, there are a couple of nuclei. Remember, a nucleus in the central nervous system are collections of cell bodies. And so these neurosecretory cells of these two different nuclei produce the hormones. So the neurosecretory cells of the paraventricular nucleus produces the hormone oxytocin, and the neurosecretory cells of the supraoptic nucleus produces antidiuretic hormone. And what happens is it gets produced in the same way that neurotransmitters are produced, and it gets transported in the same way that neurotransmitters are produced in any neuron. So it goes down the axon over here, and it's actually then the axon basically finishes up in the posterior pituitary. And in the posterior pituitary, these hypothalamic hormones are then stored until there's a signal from the to the posterior pituitary to release these hormones, right? So posterior pituitary hormones produced by the hypothalamus and released and stored and released from the posterior pituitary. The other pituitary gland is called the anterior pituitary or the adenohypophysis. Adeno refers to endocrine glands. And what happens in the adenohypophysis is that the cells in the anterior pituitary actually do synthesize the hormones that it stores and releases, right? And so what happens over here, again, this is the posterior pituitary that you see over here, and the diagram down below is that of the anterior pituitary. And so what you see is that there's a few different types of cells in the anterior pituitary that produces, stores, and releases hormone. And what happens is the link between the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus is the fact that the hypothalamus releases hypothalamic hormones, and that travels directly to the anterior pituitary, and those hypothalamic hormones can regulate the release of the anterior pituitary hormones. We'll talk about that more as we go along. The pathway or the blood vessel between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary is a portal circuit. So remember, a portal circuit is where you have blood from the heart going to target organ 1, and from organ 1 it goes to organ 2 before returning back to the heart, right? So it goes from one capillary bed to a second capillary bed before going back to the heart. And so what happens is that the hypothalamus can release very small amounts of this hypothalamic hormone because it goes straight to the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary then has receptors that are specific for the hypothalamic hormones. When we get to this slide, we see the link between the hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus, released into the hypophyseal portal system, and then travel directly to the anterior pituitary. So if you look over here, what you see here is you can see groups of hormones. So you've got group 1, group 2, group 3, group 4, group 5, and they match to different cells on the anterior pituitary. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and these cells in the anterior pituitary then produce hormones 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the fifth group. So I'm just explaining to you just the structure of this slide, and then I'm going to go through what each of them does. If you look at the hypothalamic hormones, you can see that they follow a pattern. So quite a few of these hypothalamic hormones, if you look at the last two letters, they have RH, 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 RH. And RH stands for releasing hormones. So, and then you've got two other hormones that are released by the hypothalamus that have a different ending, and the ending here is IH. So IH stands for inhibiting hormone. So out of the 7 hormones that are listed here that are produced by the hypothalamus, 5 of these are releasing hormones. So that means what happens is when these releasing hormones are released by the hypothalamus, travel to the anterior pituitary, what happens is they stimulate the release of the anterior pituitary hormone. So what you can see here, GH stands for growth hormone. So you've got growth hormone releasing hormone traveling via the portal system to its specific receptors on the cells called somatotropes. And what happens is the somatotropes, once it's activated by GHRH, then releases the hormone growth hormone. Growth hormone then is released into the systemic circulation and then has its effect on the target cells. Similarly, PRH, the P stands for prolactin. So PRH, prolactin releasing hormone and prolactin inhibitory hormone, can be released by the hypothalamus, travel on to the anterior pituitary, where they have specific receptors on the lactotropes, because the role of prolactin that's released by the lactotropes in the anterior pituitary is to stimulate hormone production. Third hormone is TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone. Again, released by the hypothalamus, travels through the portal system, has its receptors on the thyrotropes. Thyrotropes then release TSH. TSH stands for thyroid stimulating hormone. No surprises where it goes. It goes to the thyroid gland, and what happens is when it actually binds to the receptors on the thyroid gland, then the thyroid gland releases thyroid hormones T3 and T4. CRH, corticotropin releasing hormone, has specific receptors, binds to specific receptors on the corticotropes. That then stimulates release of ACTH, which stands for adrenal corticotropin hormone, and once it's released, it then binds to its receptors in the adrenal cortex to release the hormone cortisol. And then the last one is gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH, binds to receptors on gonadotropes. Gonadotropes then release the hormones LH and FSH, luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. They then get released into the systemic circulation and bind to their specific receptors on reproductive tissue, which then does its bit. So you've got the link between the hypothalamic hormones, the adenohypophyseal hormones, as well as the endocrine hormones over here. I also just want to note that these hormones are under a negative feedback loop. So, for example, if there's too much T3 and T4 thyroid hormones being produced, what happens is that excessive production of thyroid hormone will actually put a brake to the production of TSH by the anterior pituitary, and also put a brake on the production of TRH by the hypothalamus, so that then it has a negative feedback loop, and the effect of the negative feedback loop is to reduce the release of T3 and T4 back to normal. Each of the other four sets of hormones that are released within the hypothalamic pituitary axis also fall under the same regulatory mechanisms. As you can see here, hormones of the anterior pituitary are also called tropic hormones because they have a stimulating effect on other endocrine glands in order to actually release those hormones by those other endocrine glands. Over here, we've got an overview slide of each of the 7 hormones over here. So you've got the hormones that are released by the hypothalamus, gonadotropin releasing hormone, thyrotropin releasing hormone, prolactin releasing hormone, which is acts together with its antagonist prolactin inhibitory hormone. You've got growth hormone releasing hormone that's inhibited by growth hormone inhibiting hormone, and then you've got the corticotropin releasing hormone. When they're released, they act on specific receptors on specific cells that are highlighted in the yellow over here that are found in the anterior pituitary. This anterior pituitary cells then release these hormones over here, These hormones then enter into the systemic circulation. They bind to specific receptors on these target cells. And when they bind to the specific receptors on these respective target cells, they have this specific effects. Right? So this is a great summary slide for you to learn and to try to work out just the patterns. If you work out the pattern, you don't have to memorize it. Trust me. Moving on to the posterior pituitary. Posterior pituitary is sometimes referred to as a neurohypophysis because they do not actually produce the hormones that it releases. They are produced by the hypothalamus. So the two hormones that are released by the posterior pituitary are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. And what we can see over here, as I explained, is that the oxytocin is produced by cell bodies in the paraventricular nucleus of the hypothalamus, and then it's stored in the neurohypophysis in the posterior pituitary. It is involved, it is one of the few hormones that is regulated by a positive loop, right? Most other hormones are regulated by a negative loop. Its release is triggered during childbirth with uterine contractions, and it also is released when an infant starts suckling on the lactating breast. And the suckling of the infant on a lactating breast then releases oxytocin, and what oxytocin does is it promotes milk ejection. Milk production is the purview of prolactin, right? So you need these two hormones working together because if not, then the infant can just keep on suckling with no milk being produced, right? So prolactin produces the milk, oxytocin regulates milk ejection. Second hormone is antidiuretic hormone. Sometimes it's called antidiuretic hormone, is also called vasopressin because it increases blood pressure, right? Vaso refers to blood vessels, pressin refers to pressure. And so you can see here ADH is produced by cells in the supraoptic nucleus of the hypothalamus, travels down, is stored in the posterior pituitary, and its release is regulated by a negative feedback loop. So it's the more common type of feedback loop that most other hormones are regulated by. ADH, when you look at the name, ADH, anti is against. Diuretic refers to diuresis or urination. So what happens is it's against urination. So it decreases the volume of urine produced. So instead of water leaving the body, what happens is water in the kidney returns to blood, to the body. And so you can see here, it is released during periods of dehydration in order to increase the amount of water that returns to the body, right? So when water returns to the blood, to the body, urine volume is minimized. And because water is returned to the blood, then what happens is blood volume increases. And when blood volume increases, blood pressure also follows. As I said, the other name for antidiuretic hormone is vasopressin. And so one of the other effects of ADH is that it constricts the pressure within small artery. It constricts the small arteries, and so when it causes vasoconstriction, then it leads directly to an increase in blood pressure. So this slide basically gives you an overview of how ADH works. So again, you've got dehydration that is sensed as either an increase in osmolarity, hyperosmolarity, or a decrease in plasma or blood volume, or a decrease in blood pressure. Any of the situation will activate the osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus. That then sends a signal to the posterior pituitary to release ADH into the systemic circulation. As I said, ADH can also be released when there is a thirst sensation, when you feel thirsty. That also leads to a thirst sensation. And when you feel thirsty, what happens is that person ends up trying to find something to drink, right? The specific effects, and that's also an effect of triggering the osmoreceptors. With ADH being released into the systemic circulation, as I said, it causes vasoconstriction of the smaller arteries to increase blood pressure directly, and it also binds to receptors in the collecting ducts in the renal nephrons, in part of the kidney. And what happens when ADH is released? If you look at the diagram down below, what happens is there are these aquaporins. And again, if you look at the word aquaporins, aqua refers to water, porins refers to pores or holes. So what happens is that there are these proteins called aquaporins that respond to ADH binding to its specific receptors. So when ADH binds to receptors, what happens is these aquaporins are then inserted into the collecting tubules in the kidney. And what happens is they allow water to pour in through the epithelial cells of the collecting tubules, collecting ducts, to go back and return into the blood. And so by this mechanism, you've got water leaving the collecting duct, returning into the blood, less urine is produced, more plasma volume is produced, and that increase in plasma volume then also increases blood pressure. Together with that direct increase in blood pressure, the insertion of the aquaporins, and the fact that the person then experiences a thirst sensation which leads to drinking. And when you drink, then what happens is that drink that you drink eventually ends up being absorbed through your digestive tract, so your plasma volume increases. And so when your plasma volume increases then your osmolarity in the blood then goes back down to normal, right? So again, this is a way for the body to maintain homeostasis in terms of blood pressure, osmolarity, as well as blood volume. Moving on to the second hormone that's released by the posterior pituitary. As I said, this is one of the few hormones that's regulated by positive feedback. Stimulus for release is the movement of the fetus from the uterus during childbirth. So as the fetus moves into the birth canal, what happens is as the head, the body of the fetus moves, it actually activates stretch receptors over here, and the stretch receptors send a signal to the brain, to the posterior pituitary to release oxytocin. Oxytocin then travels in through the bloodstream. Oxytocin then binds to specific receptors in the uterus to increase the frequency of the uterine contractions as well as the strength of the uterine contractions. So that's why the uterine contractions increase in terms of rate as well as in terms of strength. That squeezes the baby out through the birth canal, and then once the baby is actually born, there's no more stretch receptors being activated, and so the release of oxytocin then drops. Oxytocin can also be released, as I said, when an infant suckles at the lactating breast, and that causes the release of milk that is produced with the help of prolactin. Moving on to growth hormone. So the release of growth hormone by the anterior pituitary is controlled by the hypothalamic hormones, growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone inhibitory hormone. And from the name, you can see that GRIH stimulates the release of growth hormone. GHIH inhibits the release of growth hormone. As the name suggests, growth hormones help things grow. So it's an anabolic hormone, and so it promotes protein synthesis and tissue building directly and indirectly via insulin-like growth factors. It stimulates the breakdown of fats, causing the fat to release causing tissues to use fatty acids rather than glucose for energy. So it's called glucose sparing because the fatty acids are used as a source of energy rather than glucose. And it also stimulates the liver to break down glycogen to glucose, right? And the glucose then is used to actually stimulate growth and development of other tissues. So again, you've got the increase in glucose in the blood, and then the effects of growth hormone on things like bone cells, muscle cells, nervous system cells, immune system cells. Next hormone is the pineal gland. We touched on this when we talked about the central nervous system previously. So the pineal gland contains pinealocyte cells, which produce and secrete the hormone melatonin. So as you can see over here, melatonin production is increased when we're sleeping. So if you look at the levels of the red melatonin hormone, it goes up when we're sleeping, and is at low levels when we're awake, and then goes up when we're sleeping again. Right? This is opposite to the cortisol levels. So you see here cortisol levels increase when we're awake and decrease when we're sleeping. In any event, melatonin is used sometimes as an artificial hormone in order to stimulate and regulate our sleep-wake cycles. So what happens is when light hits the retina of the eyes during the day, it activates a nucleus in the hypothalamus called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. Then it sends a signal to the spinal cord and the pineal gland to inhibit the production and secretion of melatonin. And when melatonin levels are low, then wakefulness is promoted, right? So that's why melatonin is produced at night. It promotes sleepiness. When there's low levels of melatonin, we tend to be more awake. Moving on to the next endocrine gland, which is the thyroid gland. So the thyroid gland, you can see here, are in the front and the sides of the trachea, so anterior and lateral surfaces of the trachea, just below the level of the larynx. And what you can see here is we've got two thyroid glands on either side of the trachea, and it's joined together by a connecting isthmus. And when we look at the cells in the thyroid gland, what we see is we can see these big follicles over here. So you've got these big follicles that contain colloid, right? And they're hollow as well, so they contain a colloid, and the colloid are where the thyroid hormones are produced. Around the follicle, you've got the follicle cells, right, which are part of the epithelium, and then around the follicle cells, you've also got the parafollicular cells. So the parafollicular cells are located outside of the follicles, and they also are an endocrine cell. They produce the hormone calcitonin, which is involved in calcium homeostasis. The thyroid hormones are, we've got two types, T3 and T4. Right? The function of the thyroid hormone is to help regulate metabolic rate of all cells, help to regulate cell growth, help to regulate tissue differentiation. Thyroid hormones is stored in large amounts in the follicle of the thyroid glands. And so what happens is that we have a few months worth of thyroid hormone stored in those follicles. So our thyroid gland can stop working in, say, January. We probably won't know until June that it has truly stopped working because it takes a few months for the reserve supply of the thyroid hormones to run out. In terms of the regulation of the thyroid hormones, it's regulated by negative feedback, and it involves TRH that's produced by the hypothalamus and thyrotropin stimulating and thyroid stimulating hormone that's released by the anterior pituitary, right? Thyroid hormones also bind to plasma proteins. And so what happens is they need to bind to plasma proteins in order for it to be transported in the bloodstream. As I said, we've got two versions of the thyroid hormones, T4 or tetraiodothyronine, often called thyroxine, and T3, triiodothyronine, is the second version. T4 contains 4 iodine ions. T3 contains 3 iodine ions. You can see T4 is found in higher and greater amounts in the bloodstream. It binds more strongly to TBG. So TBG is the plasma protein that helps to transport the thyroid hormone. And T4 stimulates weakly, and so what happens is it has to really be converted into T3 in order to have an action, right? So T4 is converted to T3 before it can have any sort of strong action. So when we look at T3, it's stronger in action in its effect than T4, and it's the main thyroid hormone that actually leads to most of the effects associated with thyroid hormone. Many cells convert T4 to T3 through the removal of iodine ion, because again, T4 has 4 iodine atoms and T3 only has 3. And so what you can see here in the diagram is just how thyroid hormone release is regulated, right? So if there's low levels of T3 and T4, what happens is it activates the hypothalamus to release thyrotropin releasing hormone. That then goes to the anterior pituitary to trigger the release of TSH. Then TSH then binds to receptors in the thyroid hormone to release T3 and T4. When levels are too high, then what happens is by a process of negative feedback, it stops or inhibits TRH release and also stops or inhibits the release of TSH from the anterior pituitary until the levels of T3 and T4 go back down to normal. Over here, what you see is the effect of release of T3 and T4. You can see it increases the basal metabolic rate of body cells, and it also can lead to an increase of body temperature because your body cells are more active than normal. That it also leads to an increase in body temperature. This slide goes through the synthesis of the T3 and T4 hormone. So what we start off with is the synthesis of the thyroglobin protein in the follicular cells. And then what happens is that the thyroglobin then enters the colloid of the thyroid follicle by exocytosis. Iodine also moves from the blood into the colloid of the thyroid follicle, and from the colloid into the cell. And then what happens is that iodide ion is oxidized to iodine, and then it gets joined up together with the thyroglobin. And so what you have over here is in 7 over here, you've got the start of the formation of T4 here and T3. So you see T4 has 4 iodine, T3 has 3 iodine. This this huge molecule then gets engulfed in a vesicle through a process of endocytosis, and then what happens is that follicle um, um, then gets broken down by a process of proteolysis, and then proteolysis then breaks down this thyroid globulin into single T4 and T3 molecules, and then they enter into the blood through the monocarboxylate transporter, where they bind to plasma proteins for easy transport in the blood. So there's a lot going on here, but if you actually break it down and follow the chart over here, then it might be simpler for you. The next set of hormones are hormones that regulate blood calcium levels. So the two hormones are calcitonin and parathyroid hormone. We talked about this when we talked about the lecture on bone. So calcitonin is produced by the parafollicular cells, also called the C cells of the thyroid gland. Parathyroid hormone, or PTH, is produced by the chief cells in the parathyroid hormone. Out of the two hormones, PTH is the primary hormone, and so we've seen this diagram before, and this one basically just lines out the essentials of the diagram above. So what you can see here is when blood calcium level drops, what happens is it stimulates the parathyroid gland to release PTH, and then what happens is PTH then helps to break down bone in order to release calcium into the bloodstream. It also acts on the kidney, so the PTH receptors on the kidney that help to return calcium back into the blood from the tubule, and it also then works on the intestine to try to absorb any calcium that we've ingested into the bloodstream. Sometimes there's too much PTH being released, and when that happens, blood calcium levels increase. So when blood calcium levels increase, it causes the release of calcitonin from the parafollicular cells on the thyroid gland. And what happens with calcitonin is it acts on the bone primarily to stimulate the production of new bone. So it stimulates the activity of osteoblasts to remove calcium from the blood, to deposit that calcium from the blood onto the bone. Next one is the adrenal glands. So the adrenal glands, when you look at the name adrenal, so renal refers to kidney, ad is above. So you can see here the adrenal glands are located above on the top of the kidney, right? The adrenal gland can be divided into two parts, the inner part called the medulla and the outer part called the cortex. We've talked about the adrenal medulla before. The adrenal medulla releases hormones that are related to the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. So the hormones that it releases when the sympathetic division of the ANS is stimulated are epinephrine and norepinephrine. The outer portion of the adrenal gland is called the adrenal cortex, and you can see here that it can be split up into three areas. So there's the zona glomerulosa, the zona fasciculata, and the zona reticularis. And each of these different zones produce different types of hormones. So the more superficial zone, the zona glomerulosa, produces mineralocorticoids. An example of a mineralocorticoid is aldosterone. The next one down produces glucocorticoids. Again, it's called glucocorticoids because it regulates glucose. And so an example of that would be cortisol, corticosterone, and cortisone. And then the innermost layer of the adrenal cortex produces androgens, which stimulate masculinization, right? And an example of an androgen is listed over here. So that's what this one spells out. When we look at the three different hormones that's produced by the adrenal cortex, what you can see here is that the aldosterone is the prime mineralocorticoid hormone, and it has an effect on electrolyte levels. So it helps to maintain uh, potassium, hydrogen, and sodium levels. And it uses the system called the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. And we'll look at that in the next slide. In the next couple of slides. The next hormone down is cortisol. So cortisol is the most abundant glucocorticoid hormones, and cortisol plays an important role in the long-term stress response. And so when we're stressed for any period of time, either mentally or physically, what happens is then it triggers the hypothalamus to release CRH, which then acts on the anterior pituitary to release ACTH, which then acts on the adrenal cortex to release cortisol, right? Cortisol affects every cell in the body. So there is a lot of effects that cortisol does, and we're going to look at that in the next slide as well. And then the third type of hormone produced by the adrenal cortex are androgens that are similar in function to the male sex hormone. So an abundance or an excess of androgens in a female can influence the appearance of pubic and axillary hair in the armpits. Again, trigger for release is is long-term stress, and it's controlled by ACTH, which is released by the anterior pituitary. Androgens then can bind to receptors that are found in cells that are affected by other sex hormones. When we look at this, what we can see is the response to stress. So our body has two different responses to stress. One is short term, that's mediated by the sympathetic arm of the autonomic nervous system. And the short term response to stress will involve the release of norepinephrine as a neurotransmitter and the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine as hormones from the adrenal medulla. What you can see here is a short-term response to stress. So blood pressure increases, heart rate increases, blood pressure increases, the amount of glucose in the blood increases. The bronchioles in your lungs increase in terms of size so that more air can go through. Less blood goes to the digestive system and the kidney, and then the metabolic rate of cells is increased in order to try to produce enough energy to run away or to deal with the stress. If stress is more prolonged, then that's when the endocrine system kicks in. So the two hormones, the series of hormones involved in the stress response, longer term stress response, are CRH from the hypothalamus, ACTH from the anterior pituitary, and then the release of mineralocorticoids, so aldosterone, and glucocorticoids, so cortisol. And what you can see here is that in terms of long-term response to stress, it increases the amount of water and sodium retained by the kidneys, which then, if you increase the water retention, then blood volume will increase, and when you increase blood volume, blood pressure will increase. In terms of cortisol, what happens is it leads to, if you look over here, an increase in the amount of glucose that's present in the blood, and it also suppresses the immune system. So that's why cortisol is sometimes given to actually suppress the immune system. When we get to how the aldosterone hormone works, aldosterone release is triggered as part of the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system. So again, it's a mouthful because it involves a few different compounds along the way. So the first compound to be released in the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system is the first compound mentioned here, which is renin. That's produced by the kidney. Renin is then released into the blood, and what renin does is it acts as an enzyme to convert angiotensinogen that's produced by the liver to angiotensin 1, right? So renin converts angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. Now, where there's a 1, there's a 2. So angiotensin 1 gets converted to angiotensin 2 with the help of a second enzyme. This enzyme is called angiotensin converting enzyme. Most of the angiotensin converting enzyme is produced by the lungs. And so again, that's released into the bloodstream to convert angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. And angiotensin 2, by its name, if you look at the word angiotensin, angio refers to blood vessels, tensin refers to pressure. So what angiotensin 2 does is it increases blood pressure through the vasoconstriction of systemic arterioles. So that's that's a direct effect of angiotensin 2. Another effect of angiotensin 2 is that it stimulates the release of aldosterone from the adrenal cortex. And what aldosterone does is it increases excretion of potassium, it increases reabsorption, return of sodium back into the blood, and it stimulates the production of the sodium-potassium ATPase pump. The next slide basically shows how the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone work. So there are a few different stimuli that can trigger the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. These triggers are detected by the macula densa cells in the distal convoluting tubules in the kidney. So the stimuli can be either increased potassium levels in the blood or in the renal tubules, decrease sodium in the renal tubules, decrease blood volume, or decrease blood pressure. Any one of them can trigger the renin-angiotensin aldosterone system. And so once that's activated, it goes through the process that's highlighted over here. And once that's activated, then what happens is vasoconstriction occurs to increase blood pressure back to normal, because again, decreased blood pressure can trigger the RAAS system. And then what happens is aldosterone increases the excretion of potassium ions and increase the return of sodium back into the body to increase water reabsorption. And when you increase water reabsorption, you increase blood volume back to normal. And when you increase blood volume back to normal, then you increase blood pressure back to normal. So what you can see over here is the renin-angiotensin aldosterone system helps to maintain homeostasis, right? So if it's triggered by increased potassium levels, the effect is potassium levels decrease. Triggered by decreased sodium levels, then the effect is that sodium levels then increase and all that kind of stuff. So returns to homeostatic level. The last group of hormones that I want to cover are the hormones that are produced in the endocrine pancreas. So when we look at the pancreas, over 90% of the cells in the pancreas have an exocrine gland. So they produce stuff but the stuff that they produce, the digestive enzymes, the pancreatic juice, is not secreted into the bloodstream, but it's secreted into the small intestine. So you can see here, this is the pancreas over here, and digestive enzymes and pancreatic juices are secreted right into the first part of the small intestine, whereas only 2 to 3% of cells in the pancreas secrete hormones. So the cells collectively are called the pancreatic islets, the islets of Langerhans, and these form part of the endocrine pancreas. So you can see here there's 4 different cells that form the pancreatic islets. Each of these different cells produce a different hormone. So most of the cells are beta cells. They produce the hormone insulin. The hormone insulin then acts to reduce the amount of glucose that's present in the blood. The alpha cells produce the hormone glucagon, which acts to increase the levels of glucose in the blood. The delta cells produce the hormone somatostatin. Again, when you look at the word somato, refers to body, statin is static or stay still. Somatostatin acts in a way similar to growth hormone inhibitory hormone, so it inhibits the release of insulin and glucagon. And then the last cell that I'm going to talk about here are the PP cells. PP stands for pancreatic polypeptide, and pancreatic polypeptide has a role in appetite and a role in regulating the pancreatic exocrine and endocrine secretions. If you look at the role overall of the pancreatic hormones, you can see that they're very, very tightly linked to what we eat and drink or not, right? So they're very tightly linked to the function of the digestive tract. This next slide shows you how blood glucose levels are regulated by a combination of insulin and glucagon. So starting from the left-hand side of the slide, when we undergo periods of fasting or prolonged labor or exercise, what happens is our blood sugar level will drop, and that decrease in blood sugar level is referred to as hypoglycemia. So emia is in the blood, hypo means low, glycemia refers to glucose, so low glucose levels in the blood. That's detected by the pancreas. And so what happens is when low blood glucose levels are detected by the pancreas, then it causes glucagon, the hormone, to be released by alpha cells in the pancreas. And what glucagon does is it stimulates breakdown of glycogen to glucose. Remember, glycogen is just a huge polymer of glucose monomers joined together. It stimulates the conversion of amino acids and glycerol down to glucose, and that again is a process called gluconeogenesis, and it also stimulates lipolysis. Lipolysis is when lipids break down, in this case triglycerides, get broken down to the glycerol backbone. Remember, triglycerides have got a glycerol backbone and 3 fatty acids. So what happens is that glucagon breaks this down into the fatty acids and the glycerol backbone. And so what you have is you have an increase in glucose in the blood. So blood glucose then increases to normal. On the other side of the slide occurs when after a meal, when we eat a meal, it's sure to contain some sugar, and then what that sugar does is it causes an increase in the blood glucose level, so hyper-increased glucosemia in the blood. That's detected by the pancreas, causes the beta cells in the pancreas to release insulin, and then what insulin does is it retrieves glucose from the blood to store it in liver, so it removes glucose in the blood. It stops these 2 processes over here so that you don't have release or production of new glucose, and it also stimulates the uptake or the moving of glucose into the body cells so that the cells can use it to generate ATP and for other purposes. And so this 3 things help to remove glucose from the blood, and so blood glucose level then returns to normal. Same thing is depicted in this diagram here. So again, you've got, if you have increased blood glucose levels, causes release of insulin to do that. If you have a decrease in blood glucose levels, stimulates the release of glucagon, and it has that effect so that blood glucose levels in both cases go back to normal, right? And then the last slide over here is all the other hormones that I'm not going to talk about in this lecture, because we either will talk about it or we have talked about it. So for example, we have talked about the hormone in the skin that is that modifies a chemical to actually help form vitamin B. And we'll talk about each, and we have talked about thrombopoietin that helps trigger formation of platelets in the bone marrow. We've talked about, where is it? Erythropoietin that helps to trigger red blood formation in the bone marrow. We've talked about calcitriol. We've talked about renin over here as well, right? So some of these we've talked about. We've talked about angiotensinogen, for example, but there are others that we have not talked about because I'm going to reserve that when we talked about the reproductive system, as well as the digestive system and the fluid electrolyte balance. All right, on that note, I'm going to finish up. I hope that this was a good lecture for you to listen to.